Today, the highest court in the land granted convicted terrorist Abdul Nasir Benbrika a massive victory. The man who plotted large-scale terrorist attacks in Melbourne, including plans to inflict maximum carnage at a packed MCG, had his citizenship revoked by Peter Dutton back in 2020. The then Home Affairs Minister said Benbrika would be sent back to Algeria once he was released from prison. He explained it doesn't matter who it is. If it's a person that's posing a significant terror risk to our country, then we will do whatever is possible within Australian law to protect Australians. Well, today, the High Court, in a majority decision, not a unanimous one, deemed that Benbrika's rights were breached and that the separation of powers makes the punishment of criminal conduct exclusively judicial, even if the punishment is separated from the adjudication of that criminal guilt. So in other words, the court determined that the laws Peter Dutton operated under in cancelling this terrorist citizenship were not constitutional because they gave the minister powers that should only be exercised by the judiciary. But as I mentioned, this was not a unanimous decision. In a dissenting ruling, Justice Simon Stewart stated that cancellation of citizenship should be seen as recognition that an individual has, by their extreme conduct, separated themselves from the community and the country. He added there was no evidence before the court that Benbrika has in any way renounced his commitment to violent jihad and hence to terrorism. Now, Benbrika is currently behind bars, thank God, but he's eligible for release. He's being held on a continued detention order, but that is due to expire on December 23. Today, the Prime Minister was asked about this High Court ruling and he had this to say.
Quite clearly there was an issue with the former government's legislation, which is what this ruling relates to. But when it comes to the legal consequences, we'll seek advice for the ruling and respond appropriately.
Now to a familiar theme that is emerging at pro-Palestinian, or should that be anti-Israel, protests around the country, including one today at the offices of Defence Minister Richard Marles. It looks like the same neo-Marxist malcontents who are at every leftist rally, from BLM and those Invasion Day protests to global warming protests. The same anti-West, anti-capitalist, anti-colonialism grievance mongers who want to delegitimise modern Australia. The same activist class that's been emboldened by weak selective policing, particularly here in Victoria. There's also determination at these rallies to link the Palestinian cause with the supposed oppression of Indigenous Australians. We have heard speakers link the two groups repeatedly, and these protests often feature Aboriginal flags and extensive acknowledgement of country announcements. And those same familiar themes about colonialism, imperialism, stolen land, illegal settlements and genocide. They're repeated over and over again, with Israel and Australia condemned as barbaric apartheid states. And incredibly, in these pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli protests, there have been groups such as Queers for Palestine, Gays for Palestine, just incredible examples of leftist activists advocating for those who would have them locked up, bashed and even killed. Here are a few seconds of this lunacy on display from Europe to the US.
Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
It's little wonder that groups such as Queers for Palestine have been likened to chickens for KFC. On the weekend, an individual identifying as a black, queer, anti-Zionist Jew spoke at the Melbourne pro-Palestinian rally. And again, this speaker linked the Palestinian cause to the Indigenous one.
This colony's government has pledged its support for the Israel regime. This comes as no surprise. This colony is built upon white supremacy and settler colonialism. It bleeds out from its foundations. Of course, so-called Australia supports a racist, genocidal regime. This racist colony happily murders its own Indigenous people, our families. It happily dehumanizes our men and boys the same way Palestinian men and boys are dehumanized, and sees our children as being just as expendable as it sees yours.
What can you say to that? How can you reason with that worldview? And how can you convince people who identify as queer and yet rail against Israel, the only country in the Middle East where they are afforded full rights?